Jack Reynolds, a retired mechanical engineer, lived peacefully on the edge of a tightly run HOA community with his beloved 1949 Massey Ferguson tractor. The HOA president, Cheryl, obsessed with control, viewed Jack's polished tractor as a threat to her perfect little world. After months of passive-aggressive letters and fines Jack laughed off, Cheryl finally made an aggressive move by trying to tow the tractor without permission. Jack, prepared with heavy-duty locks and legal documentation, stood calmly as the situation spiraled into a comedy of errors. With the help of his cousin Rick, the local sheriff, Jack turned the tables and exposed Cheryl's unlawful actions for all to see. This story unfolds on a quiet morning when all I wanted was a cup of coffee, but ended up with front-row seats to one of the most absurd HOA battles you could imagine, so pull up a chair and listen close. The screech of tires and the shrill bark of a furious woman jolted me awake at 6 in the morning, a time when only farmers and lunatics were supposed to be moving about. I stumbled onto my porch wearing nothing but pajama bottoms, still wiping sleep from my eyes, only to find the president of the HOA, Cheryl, red-faced and barking into a walkie-talkie. Two burly guys, clearly regretting their career choices, were struggling to hook my beloved 1949 Massey Ferguson tractor to a flatbed truck so small it looked better suited for hauling bicycles than vintage machinery. I leaned against the railing, coffee cup in hand, watching the circus unfold like it was my own private Saturday morning cartoon. Their tow straps snapped almost immediately, sending one of the men tumbling headfirst into the meticulously trimmed bushes Cheryl had once fined me over for not pruning correctly. As the rising sun lit up the chaos below and Cheryl screeched like a smoke alarm from hell, I decided it was time they understood exactly what kind of storm they had poked. My name's Jack Reynolds, proud owner of 3 acres of rugged paradise that technically sits outside the HOA's jurisdiction, a detail Cheryl either ignored or refused to understand. When I first moved here, the land was raw, perfect for restoring my old tractor and planting a few trees. I had zero interest in community meetings, rules about mailbox colors, or whatever nonsense they obsessed over. But Cheryl, queen of her perfectly manicured domain, saw my tractor as an abomination against her vision of suburban bliss. Never mind that the machine gleamed with fresh paint and hand-polished chrome. To her, it represented defiance, and that could not be tolerated. It started small, with snippy little notices taped to my door about non-conforming agricultural equipment. I framed the first angry letter and hung it proudly above the tractor's steering wheel as a reminder not to take life too seriously. When the fines came next, I ignored them because legally, they had no ground to stand on. My property predated the HOA by 4 decades, and their rules held no sway over me. But logic only made Cheryl dig her heels in deeper. Every time she lost a battle, she doubled down. I have to admit, part of me enjoyed it, watching her twist herself into knots over something so ridiculous. Still, even I was caught off guard when she escalated from nasty notes to outright attempted theft. That morning, standing there barefoot and amused, I watched the 2 tow guys sweat bullets as they tried to figure out how to move a tractor that outweighed their truck 3 times over. I had taken precautions after all. Heavy-duty wheel locks, disconnected battery, hidden GPS tracker, and a security system that would make Fort Knox jealous. Years of designing systems for million-dollar homes taught me a thing or 2 about protecting what mattered. A tractor was easy in comparison. I ambled down to the fence and lifted my coffee cup in a friendly toast as one of the tow guys wiped his forehead and muttered about needing a bigger rig. Cheryl, practically vibrating with rage, spun on her heels to face me, spitting out words about HOA violations and authorized removals. I shrugged lazily, pointing out that according to the county registrar, my land was outside HOA control and that what they were doing was trespassing. Cheryl's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air while the tow truck guys exchanged a nervous glance. Still, one of them decided to give it another go, revving the tiny engine of the flatbed and yanking hard on the chain wrapped around my tractor's axle. The truck barely moved an inch, but the front bumper groaned ominously before the entire rig shuddered and smoked as tires spun helplessly against the ground. The chain snapped again with a vicious crack, narrowly missing Cheryl's designer handbag, which she clutched to her chest as if shielding herself from incoming artillery. It was around this time that I made 2 calls. First to my lawyer, who was already half expecting something like this, and then to my cousin Rick, sheriff of this part of the county and a man who considered HOA disputes the best free entertainment around. True to form, Rick showed up within 15 minutes, lights flashing purely for dramatic effect, not out of any real emergency. He stepped out, surveyed the wreckage, and whistled low under his breath. Well, well, well. Looks like someone's trying to steal a tractor that doesn't belong to them, he drawled in that slow southern tone that drove impatient people like Cheryl crazy. Cheryl launched into a frantic tirade about community standards and aesthetic violations, but Rick just raised a hand, silencing her instantly. Ma'am, unless you have a court order, a property lien, or 3 tow trucks bigger than that Tonka toy, you're trespassing and attempting theft. The blood drained from Cheryl's face faster than a sinking ship. The 2 tow guys backed off so fast you'd think the tractor was radioactive. Rick took a few quick statements, scribbled out some citations, and handed Cheryl a shiny new notice of unlawful trespass and malicious property interference. Watching her face crumple in disbelief was better than the strongest cup of coffee. As Cheryl called off the tow truck in humiliated defeat, retreating with her high heels clicking furiously down the sidewalk, I spent the rest of the morning leisurely polishing the tractor's hood and sipping fresh coffee. I knew, deep in my gut, that this wasn't the last I'd see of Cheryl. People like her didn't know how to quit. They only knew how to dig themselves in deeper. And when she came back for another round, I'd be ready. Because if she thought she could win a war over my tractor, she was about to find out she had picked the wrong farmer to mess with. The sun had barely finished rising the next morning when I heard the heavy grumble of diesel engines rolling slowly down the street, their low rumble rattling the windows like distant thunder. I knew without even looking that Cheryl was back, and she had come loaded for war. I didn't even bother grabbing my coffee this time. I slipped on my boots, still barefoot otherwise, and strolled outside to meet the day head-on. Across the field, a new circus was rolling into town. Gone were the dinky flatbeds and fraying tow straps of yesterday. In their place stood a monstrous tow truck, the kind you usually see rescuing overturned semis from ditches after highway wrecks. Its sheer size was laughable compared to my old Massey Ferguson tractor, but Cheryl stood proudly beside it anyway, arms crossed and face glowing with smug satisfaction as if she had summoned a titan to crush a flea. Flanking her were 2 of her loyal HOA security guards, men whose presence was somehow made more ridiculous by their matching polo shirts and oversized radios that crackled with static every few seconds. They stood stiffly at attention, like mall cops guarding the entrance to a Best Buy on Black Friday. I leaned casually against the fence, savoring the morning air, watching as the massive tow truck maneuvered carefully onto the shoulder near my property line. The driver, a grizzled man who looked like he had seen more bad decisions than good roads in his lifetime, hopped down and walked around the tractor, clipboard in hand. His face went from professional detachment to thinly veiled frustration in less than a minute. He circled my tractor twice, scratching his head, inspecting the custom steel wheel clamps and heavy-duty security measures I had installed with a craftsman's touch. The sun glinted off the polished chrome and thick metal like a warning signal. After a long, silent minute, he walked over to me and gave a small nod. "Sir, is this yours?" he asked, almost apologetically. I nodded back, just as calm. He glanced over his shoulder at Cheryl, who was tapping her foot impatiently and shooting daggers with her eyes. The driver looked back at me, dropped his voice low, and said man to man, "There is no way we are moving that thing without risking serious damage to both the truck and the tractor. If I so much as scratch it, my company's on the hook." He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "She said you approved the removal," he added, his tone skeptical. I let out a short laugh that felt like it shook dust from my bones. "Nope," I said simply. "She lied to you." The driver nodded grimly, already backing away as he turned toward Cheryl. I watched, arms folded across my chest, as he trudged toward her. She stormed up to meet him halfway, furious, her expensive shoes sinking slightly into the gravel. They exchanged heated words, her finger jabbing the air like a bayonet while he stayed cool and unmovable. I couldn't hear every word, but the body language said it all. Finally, the driver threw up his hands, shook his head firmly, and headed back to his truck. Cheryl stood there fuming, helpless, and incandescent with rage, as the big rig roared back to life and lumbered away, leaving her standing in a cloud of diesel fumes. Her two security guards shifted uncomfortably, trying to blend into the background like they were hoping to become invisible. The defeated queen without an army. As satisfying as it was to see her plan blow up in her face again, I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Cheryl was not the type to quit after a single defeat. No, she would keep coming, like a bad rash that thinks maybe the third application of ointment will finally be the charm. Watching her rage in place only hardened my resolve. Being reactive would never be enough against someone like her. It was time to shift the battlefield. I pulled out my phone right there by the fence and made 2 calls that would change the course of everything. First to my lawyer, who had already begun building a beautiful stack of legal documentation. The second call went to my insurance company, ensuring that every trespass, every attempt at theft, every ounce of harassment was logged, time-stamped, and bulletproofed. I was not just defending anymore. I was setting the stage for a show they would never forget. Later that afternoon, after a good lunch and a quick tune-up of my Massey, I decided it was time for a little strategic repositioning. I climbed onto the tractor, the leather seat creaking familiarly beneath me, and eased it carefully down my gravel driveway. Humming a little tune to myself, I maneuvered the Massey into a new spot right along the edge of the private HOA road that served as the community's main entrance. Technically, it was still on my property, but it was close enough to block access to the precious front gate Cheryl loved to parade as the jewel of the neighborhood. Without that gate open, residents would be forced to detour through a much longer, unfinished back road pocked with ruts and potholes big enough to swallow a Volkswagen. It took less than 30 minutes for the chaos to begin. First, it was a trickle of confused SUVs and minivans pulling up and honking. Then came the backups, the frustrated shouts, the gesticulating arms waving at me from rolled-down windows. I just sat there atop the Massey like a king surveying his domain, sipping on a fresh iced tea and offering cheerful waves to every angry commuter. Cheryl arrived not long after, skidding her Lexus to a dramatic halt like a bad soap opera villain arriving for the final act. She leapt out, heels digging furiously into the gravel, face twisted into a snarl. She stomped up to the fence and launched into another tirade about illegal parking and emergency access violations. I tipped my hat lazily and pointed to the stack of legal documents tucked under my arm. Official property lines, county permissions, insurance claims. Everything in neat, signed, and sealed order. Cheryl sputtered and fumed, unable to refute it, even as the crowd of residents grew larger, their patience with her antics wearing thinner by the second. Someone in the back of the gathering muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Just leave the man and his tractor alone." Another voice chimed in, "Yeah, at least he is not raising the HOA dues for no reason." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Cheryl's face twitched violently as she realized she was losing not just the battle, but the war for public opinion. She whipped out her phone, likely calling for backup. Within 20 minutes, her so-called HOA security squad arrived, 3 beefy guys who looked more suited for a fast food eating contest than a security operation. They approached me cautiously, holding clipboards and radios, trying desperately to look official. One particularly brave soul stepped forward and declared that I was violating emergency access protocols. I raised an eyebrow and asked, "Where's the emergency?" He flipped through his papers, clearly stalling. before finally muttering something about it could be an emergency in theory. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. I pointed to the side where my cousin Rick was once again leaning casually against his patrol car, sipping a soda and grinning like the cat that swallowed the canary. I told the guard, "Go ahead, tell the sheriff about your emergency." The poor guy turned 3 shades of pale and scurried back to his teammates without another word. The real coup de grace came when one of the neighbors, seizing the spirit of the moment, suggested we turn the whole mess into a block party. Within an hour, lawn chairs popped up everywhere. Coolers appeared like magic. Someone dragged out a portable grill and started flipping burgers. Kids raced around laughing, music blared from pickup trucks, and the entrance to the HOA, once a symbol of rules and regulations, turned into a summer festival of stubborn joy. There I sat, proudly atop my gleaming Massey Ferguson, the unofficial grand marshal of the most ridiculous rebellion in town history. Burgers sizzling on grills, laughter echoing across the fields, people hoisting cold drinks in salute. Cheryl, meanwhile, hovered on the sidelines, vibrating with helpless rage, unable to do anything but watch her authority crumble under the weight of community spirit and good old-fashioned stubbornness. It was then, under the wide-open sky with the sun setting in brilliant reds and golds behind the tree line, that I realized something deeper was happening. This was no longer just about my tractor or Cheryl's need for control. It had become something bigger, something that spoke to every person who had ever been pushed around by someone with a clipboard and a bloated sense of self-importance. It had become about standing up, laughing in the face of petty tyranny, and refusing to move just because someone said you had to. As twilight deepened and fireflies began blinking across the field, I leaned back against my tractor, a soft smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Cheryl could bring bigger trucks, louder threats, more empty words. She could even bring an army if she wanted. It would not matter. Not now. Not anymore. Because the battle lines were drawn, and the entire neighborhood had just chosen sides. And they had chosen the tractor. The third act of this slow-burning war came just 2 days later, and by that point, the whole neighborhood could feel the tension crackling in the air like a thunderstorm about to break. It wasn't a question of if Cheryl would make another move. It was when and how spectacularly she would fail trying. After the humiliations of the failed flatbed fiasco and the heavy-duty tow truck retreat, I knew she was stewing in her own bitter pride, plotting something desperate enough to make headlines. I just didn't realize how far she was willing to escalate until I saw it with my own eyes. That morning started deceptively peaceful. Birds sang, the air was crisp, and the early sunlight made everything look almost idyllic. But that illusion shattered the moment I heard the deep, mechanical whine of industrial equipment echoing down the main road. I wandered outside, boots crunching against the gravel, and what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks and laugh out loud. Cheryl had gone nuclear. Parked at the entrance to the neighborhood was not just any tow rig, but a full-blown crane truck, the kind of heavy machinery you would expect to see lifting wrecked semis off bridges after 50-car pileups. This was no dinky operation. There were stabilizers deployed into the ground, heavy-duty cables being run across the road, and a team of grim-looking men in matching uniforms coordinating like they were preparing for a NASA launch. At the center of it all, naturally, stood Cheryl, arms crossed tightly over her chest, a smirk playing across her lips like a gambler convinced she finally held the winning hand. I took my sweet time strolling down to the fence line, savoring the looks of horrified disbelief on my neighbors' faces as they gathered at safe distances with their coffee mugs and cell phones ready to record whatever train wreck was about to unfold. A few even set up folding chairs, recognizing the rare and beautiful gift of witnessing insanity in real time. The lead crane operator, a grizzled old guy with a sun-creased face and the permanent squint of someone who had seen too much nonsense in his career, walked toward me, clipboard in hand. His boots thudded heavily on the ground as he approached, and when he spoke, his voice carried the tired tone of a man who knew when he was being set up for failure. "Sir, we have been contracted to remove this vehicle," he said with the kind of weariness usually reserved for people delivering bad news to angry homeowners. I smiled politely, nodded once, and asked whether they had a court order. He frowned, looked over his shoulder at Cheryl, then back at me. She said she was authorized by the property owner. I nearly burst out laughing again. Instead, I stayed calm and told him that unless he could produce an official court order signed by a judge, any attempt to lift so much as a single wheel of my tractor would constitute grand theft, property damage, and trespassing. I even had laminated copies of the local statutes in my back pocket, ready to hand out like party favors. The man's face darkened. His jaw tightened. He turned on his heel without another word and stomped over to Cheryl, waving his clipboard at her like a weapon. I couldn't hear every word from where I stood, but the hand gestures and red-faced sputtering said enough. The crane operator, clearly furious, barked at her for lying, for risking his business, his truck, and possibly his entire career. Cheryl tried arguing, tried blustering, tried stomping her heels like a child throwing a tantrum in a toy store aisle. But it was no use. The man had seen enough, and he was not about to go down for someone else's power trip. As the crane crew packed up, Cheryl's face turned a shade of purple so deep it looked painful. Refusing to accept defeat, she barked fresh orders at her HOA security squad, those same poor saps in ill-fitting uniforms who already looked like they regretted every life choice that had led them to this moment. She commanded them to seize the tractor themselves, waving her arms like a general directing an ill-fated charge. What followed was possibly the most beautiful moment of theater I had ever witnessed. The guards huddled together awkwardly, debating among themselves who would be the unlucky soul to actually climb onto the tractor. Eventually, one poor fool was chosen, and he scrambled awkwardly up the side, grabbing onto the steering wheel like it was a life preserver. The moment he touched the wheel, my custom-installed alarm system roared to life. A deafening siren hidden under the tractor's seat erupted in a wail so loud and sudden that the poor guy jumped backward as if electrocuted, tumbling onto the gravel with a yelp that echoed off the surrounding houses. Kids down the street burst into laughter. Adults doubled over, struggling to breathe. Even my neighbor Mrs. Perkins, who usually complained about everything louder than a whisper, had to wipe tears from her eyes. As if summoned by fate, my cousin Rick rolled up in his sheriff's cruiser, his timing so perfect it felt almost rehearsed. He leaned casually against the hood of his car, sipping a soda, watching the disaster unfold like it was the highlight of his week. He strolled up to me, nodding at the gathering crowd that now included at least half the neighborhood, and said with a slow drawl heard the circus came back to town. I shrugged, deadpan, bigger tent this time. Rick scanned the scene, the idling crane truck, the scattered security guards, Cheryl shrieking into her phone, and shook his head slowly. "You pressing charges?" he asked. I considered it for a moment, feeling the weight of 100 sets of eyes on me. "Not yet," I said finally. "Let's give her a little more rope." Rick chuckled deep in his chest and settled back against his cruiser to enjoy the show. I wasn't about to let this golden opportunity pass quietly. I pulled out a large, professionally printed banner from behind the tractor and carefully stretched it across the hood. In bold red letters, it read, "This tractor is protected under local, state, and federal law. Unauthorized tampering will result in criminal prosecution." The reaction from the crowd was instant and electric. Cheers erupted, people hooped and whistled. Some clapped like I had just unveiled a masterpiece. Phones flashed as neighbors snapped pictures and recorded videos for what would inevitably flood every social media platform within hours. Cheryl, meanwhile, was left standing alone by the road, vibrating with rage, her face a mask of impotent fury. She retreated to her Lexus, slamming the door so hard that the car physically rocked on its wheels. She sat there, seething, refusing to look anyone in the eye, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline and mumbling furiously under her breath. It was the raw, undeniable look of someone who had lost total control and was desperately grasping for something, anything, to claw it back. Within the hour, sure enough, videos of the entire debacle exploded online. Clips of Cheryl screaming, clips of the tow truck retreating, clips of the HOA security guard being blasted off my tractor by the alarm, all set to hilarious background music and shared thousands of times across social media. Memes popped up faster than anyone could keep track of. My favorite so far was a side-by-side image of my tractor titled Massey Ferguson 1 HA0, with a triumphant little crown photoshopped on top of the steering wheel. By that evening, local news vans were prowling the street. Reporters knocked on doors, interviewing neighbors about the chaos and asking if they could get a statement from the infamous tractor owner. I gave a few cheerful, down-home interviews, standing proudly next to my tractor, explaining that all I ever wanted was to be left in peace to restore my land and enjoy my retirement. The public ate it up. Cheryl, on the other hand, refused every request for comment. She even tried blocking news crews from entering the community gates, which only made her look guiltier. The residents, emboldened now, began openly criticizing her. Petitions to recall the HOA board began circulating almost immediately. Small toy tractors started appearing in front lawns in a quiet, humorous protest. Someone even parked their own riding mower right next to my Massey Ferguson as a show of solidarity. It was more than just a personal victory. It was the start of a movement. A stubborn red tractor had become a symbol of common sense, resistance to petty tyranny, and the sheer power of standing your ground when it matters most. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Cheryl wasn't going to take this beating lying down. She would be back, more desperate, more reckless than ever. But that was fine, because so would I. The morning after our impromptu block party dawned unusually still, the kind of thick, heavy silence that warned you trouble was brewing just beyond the horizon. It felt wrong immediately, like the air itself was holding its breath. After the circus Cheryl had unleashed with cranes and alarms and security guards, it was almost eerie to hear nothing but birds chirping and the low hum of a few early risers driving off to work. I spent the first few hours pretending to ignore it, fixing a loose board on my porch, trimming some bushes along the side of the house, but my eyes kept drifting toward the HOA gate where my beloved Massey Ferguson still sat like a loyal sentry. Every time I glanced over, a flicker of tension sparked in my chest. Sure enough, by noon, I spotted her silver Lexus creeping down the road, moving slower than usual, almost like a shark circling prey. Instead of pulling up in her usual dramatic fashion, Cheryl parked halfway down the street, partially hidden behind a row of thick bushes, and just sat there. For a good 10 minutes, she stayed inside her car, no doubt stewing, plotting, making frantic calls. I leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, sipping from a fresh cup of coffee, watching from a distance like an old man waiting for the first raindrop of a summer storm. Eventually, the car door opened and Cheryl climbed out, smoothing down her blazer, straightening her shoulders, wearing an expression so fake it would have made a used car salesman blush. She was not alone either. Behind her came two men, one dragging a camera rig on a small-wheeled dolly, the other carrying a sleek black leather briefcase. Even before I saw the setup, I knew exactly what was happening. Cheryl was switching tactics. She was trying to spin the story, to reframe herself as the wronged party and me as the menace terrorizing her peaceful little utopia. The camera guy wasted no time setting up his equipment, ignoring the growing number of neighbors gathering on their porches, lawn chairs, and driveways, all pretending to mind their own business while not so subtly recording with their phones. I stayed where I was, arms folded, sipping calmly, not giving her the satisfaction of confrontation. The man with the briefcase handed Cheryl a thick stack of papers, and with an air of pompous ceremony, she marched toward the tractor. The cameraman followed, his red recording light blinking ominously like a warning beacon. Cheryl turned toward the camera, straightened her posture, and in her best saccharine voice, launched into what had to be the most delusional, laughable performance I had ever witnessed in my life. She spoke in carefully measured tones about public safety hazards, about emergency access being blocked, about how the HOA had been forced to act because of one belligerent, unreasonable individual. She talked about preserving community values, about protecting children, about upholding standards that kept property values high and families safe. She painted herself as a martyr standing tall against an unreasonable threat, a lone defender of decency and order against the forces of chaos and stubbornness. The neighbors were doing a poor job of holding in their reactions. More than one person coughed suspiciously into their fist at strategic moments, and several outright chuckled when Cheryl held up what she called an emergency injunction, a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like something hastily printed at a Kinko's 15 minutes ago. No official seals. No signatures. Just a lot of impressive-looking legal jargon thrown together to fool the uninformed. Cheryl finished her little speech with a dramatic flourish, turning toward the Massey Ferguson as if expecting applause. Instead, she got a cold wall of silence broken only by a slow, sarcastic clap from somewhere in the crowd. Ignoring the obvious lack of support, she stormed toward the tractor, yanking a cheap padlock cutter from her purse and trying to snip through the heavy steel clamps securing the wheels. It was almost comedic, watching her struggle. The cheap cutter snapped in half after 2 pathetic squeezes, the broken metal flying harmlessly into the dirt. Cheryl stood frozen for a moment, holding the 2 useless pieces in each hand, the camera capturing every glorious second. Around us, stifled giggles turned into full-blown laughter. Someone actually fell out of their lawn chair. Furious and humiliated but too deep into the performance to back out, Cheryl threw the broken cutter aside and grabbed the wheel lock with both hands, yanking and grunting in a desperate, rage-fueled attempt to move the immovable. Her face turned redder and redder, her hair came loose from its meticulous bun, and yet she kept going, oblivious to the camera zooming in and neighbors recording from every angle. It was at that exact perfect moment that Rick pulled up, siren whooping once, more for show than necessity. He stepped out of his cruiser, calm and deliberate, the faintest smirk playing on his lips as he approached the chaos. He gave a friendly nod to the camera guy, tipped his hat toward the gathered crowd, and addressed Cheryl with a voice so steady it might as well have been chiseled from stone. "Ma'am, I am going to have to ask you to step away from the private property." Cheryl spun around, wild-eyed and furious, thrusting her fake injunction toward Rick like it was a flaming sword. Rick took the papers, gave them a quick glance, and then, in a move so slow and deliberate it might have qualified as a performance art piece, tore the entire stack neatly in half. He looked back at Cheryl, now gaping like a fish, and informed her that she had just committed attempted fraud, vandalism, trespassing, and criminal mischief. Again. The camera guy, sensing gold, zoomed in on Cheryl's face just as the chants started from the crowd. "Arrest her. Arrest her." It started small, half-joking at first, but within seconds it was loud and enthusiastic. Neighbors clapped, kids cheered, someone even started playing a drumbeat on a cooler. Rick sighed dramatically, pulled out his handcuffs, and with the efficiency of a man who had done this too many times before, gently turned Cheryl around and cuffed her hands behind her back. Cheryl screamed about civil rights violations, conspiracies, lawsuits, but it all sounded thin and pathetic against the backdrop of cheers and applause. Rick guided her to the cruiser, pausing just long enough to let the camera capture every humiliating second, before shutting the door and driving away, siren lights flashing against the midday sun. For a few heartbeats, the neighborhood was silent, stunned at the sheer spectacle we had just witnessed. Then the dam broke. Applause, laughter, hoots of victory echoed through the streets. Strangers high-fived each other. Some people hugged. More than a few came over and patted the Massey Ferguson like it was a veteran returning from war. And it didn't stop there. Within an hour, the video of Cheryl's arrest was everywhere. Local news picked it up first. Then it spread online like wildfire. Memes exploded across social media. Pictures of Cheryl screaming in handcuffs captioned with slogans like "Tractor Justice" or "When HOA Meets Reality" piled up by the hundreds. By evening, the HOA board was in full meltdown mode. Emergency meetings were called. Apologies were drafted but never released. Sponsors for the HOA's annual events began pulling out, citing the negative publicity. Residents circulated petitions for a complete recall of the HOA leadership. News vans camped outside the entrance. Interview requests flooded my mailbox. I didn't even have to attend the emergency HOA meeting later that night. I just sat on my porch, sipping a cold beer, listening to the shouts and demands that carried clearly across the field. By midnight, it was official. Cheryl was stripped of her title as HOA president, effective immediately. A recall election was scheduled for the rest of the board. Freedom, real freedom, was finally starting to bloom on the street again. Kids played without getting scowled at. Neighbors visited each other's porches without fear of fines. Laughter replaced the constant low-grade dread that had hung over the community like a cloud. And sitting there in the soft glow of the porch light, my old Massey Ferguson gleaming like a trophy in the distance, I knew deep in my heart that while the war was mostly won, there was still one final celebration needed. A victory that everyone could take part in. Something that would cement, forever, what we had all stood up for and achieved. And that, I decided, was going to be something Cheryl would never, ever be able to erase. The morning after Cheryl's official removal from the HOA presidency felt like the first truly free morning the neighborhood had experienced in years. The air itself seemed lighter, the birds louder, and the world somehow sharper, more alive. People who used to scurry from their cars to their houses, eyes averted, now lingered in driveways chatting over coffee. Kids who once tiptoed nervously across manicured lawns now raced around on bikes, their laughter ricocheting off the walls of once sterile houses. The oppressive weight that had hung invisibly over the community had been lifted, and it was almost intoxicating to feel that first real breath of freedom. But deep down, I knew we couldn't just let it pass like any other day. After everything that had happened, after every ridiculous standoff, every fight, every laugh, and every shout, we needed something more. We needed to mark it, to remember it, to celebrate the fact that ordinary people, when pushed too far, could stand together and take back what was theirs. So I decided to throw a party. Not just any party. A real, honest-to-God blowout that would remind everyone, forever, that a stubborn old tractor, a determined old man, and a fed-up community had changed everything. I called it the Tractor Freedom Festival. It started small, just a few flyers printed up late at night, handed out by the neighborhood kids who raced from door to door with the same energy they used to save for Halloween. But then word spread like wildfire. People volunteered to cook, to set up tents, to run games for the kids. Someone donated a trailer full of fireworks. A local band agreed to play live music for nothing more than some burgers and a few cold beers. By the time the weekend rolled around, the entrance to the neighborhood, the same gate Cheryl had once guarded like a personal fortress, had been transformed. Long banners stretched across the road, painted in bold, cheerful letters, "Freedom through horsepower." We stand with Jack. My old Massey Ferguson sat proudly at the center of it all, polished until it gleamed like a ruby under the afternoon sun. A small stage had been built beside it out of pallets and plywood, decorated with bunting and hand-drawn signs made by the neighborhood kids. Food trucks lined the main street, dishing out everything from brisket and tacos to ice cream sundaes piled so high they defied physics. Coolers overflowed with lemonade, sodas, and a few discreet kegs tucked behind the lemonade stand for the adults. Families lounged in folding chairs and picnic blankets. Music drifted through the air, a mix of country classics and upbeat rock anthems that had the kids dancing barefoot in the grass. It felt, in every way that mattered, like a community reborn. I stood by the tractor for a long time, just soaking it in, watching neighbors who once barely nodded at each other now laughing like old friends. Watching kids dart in and out of games of tag and sack races. Watching the elderly couple from down the street slow dance to a twangy love song playing from someone's portable speaker. It was the kind of scene you might see in a Norman Rockwell painting, if Rockwell had ever painted a red tractor at the center of a small-town rebellion. Rick showed up around mid-afternoon, still in uniform but without the usual sheriff's cruiser. Instead, he rode up on a borrowed riding lawnmower decorated with red, white, and blue streamers, grinning like a kid who had just gotten away with something. He handed me a t-shirt that read Official Tractor Security in bold letters and insisted I wear it for the big moment. I laughed so hard putting it on that I almost spilled my lemonade. Later, as the sun dipped low and the sky blazed in brilliant streaks of orange, purple, and deep blue, I climbed up onto the small stage next to the Massey. The music cut out and the crowd gathered closer, hundreds of people, some I had known for years, some I was meeting properly for the first time. I tapped the microphone and waited for the chatter to die down. I started with a joke, thanking everyone for coming to the world's first tractor-led rebellion, and promising that next year we would need a bigger tractor just to carry all the good memories. The laughter rolled over the crowd like a warm tide. But then I got serious. I talked about why this all mattered. How standing up for what is right is never convenient. How sometimes it means being stubborn when the world calls you difficult, being loud when they call you rude, being immovable when they tell you to get out of the way. I thanked everyone who had stood with me, even those who had only found their courage at the end. I thanked my Massey Ferguson for being the most loyal hunk of metal a man could ask for. And finally, I announced that every penny raised from the festival would go to a local charity that helps small farmers and property owners fight legal battles against unfair regulations and abuse of power. The cheers were deafening. Some people clapped so hard they dropped their drinks. Others wiped away tears they didn't bother hiding. Someone started chanting freedom, and soon the whole crowd joined in, a roar of voices under the darkening sky. As night fully fell, we lit the fireworks. And what fireworks they were! The budget may have been small, but the spirit behind it was massive. Rockets exploded in dazzling colors, lighting up the fields and reflecting off the polished chrome of the tractor. The grand finale spelled out a word in brilliant bursts of light: freedom. It was beautiful. It was perfect. When the last echo of the last firework faded into the soft chorus of crickets and night breezes, people lingered. They didn't want to leave. Neither did I. Small groups huddled around fire pits, roasting marshmallows, telling stories, laughing like survivors who knew they had been part of something bigger than themselves. As midnight crept closer, the crowd thinned. Families loaded sleepy kids into cars. Friends hugged goodnight. Neighbors who had once been strangers now shook hands like comrades in arms. I stayed behind, sitting on a folding chair beside my Massey Ferguson, a cold lemonade in one hand and my heart so full I thought it might burst. Somewhere in the distance, an old pickup rumbled down a back road, the sound blending perfectly into the hum of summer night. I looked up at the stars scattered across the velvet sky and realized something simple and profound. The fight had never really been about a tractor. Not truly. It had been about the right to live your life without being controlled by people who thought power gave them permission to bully others. It had been about choosing to say enough is enough. About laughing in the face of tyranny. About building a community that valued stubbornness, humor, heart, and a little good old-fashioned horsepower. Cheryl, they said, had packed up and moved out almost overnight after the arrest and the collapse of her little empire. Sold her house at a loss. Disappeared into the wider world. Some people felt sorry for her. I didn't. She hadn't been a victim. She had been a bully. And in the end, like most bullies, she had been undone not by force or violence, but by simple, unwavering refusal to bow. The Tractor Freedom Festival became a tradition. Every year we celebrated not just that one fight, but every little victory won by ordinary folks who refused to be pushed around. Every year my Massey Ferguson sat at the center of it all, polished and gleaming, a monument to stubbornness, common sense, and the quiet strength of a community that chose freedom over fear. And every year, when the festival ended, I would stay behind a little longer, sitting beside the tractor as the last embers of the fire pits died away. I would lift a cup, sometimes lemonade, sometimes something a little stronger, and toast to the future. A future where stubbornness, laughter, and a good heart would always find a place to park. Right there at the front gate,